Looking ahead to 2025, there's one camera that I'm really excited for, and that's a potential FX3 Mark II. Personally, I picked up my FX3 at the start of the 2024 wedding season, which would have been around May for me, and this has easily been my favorite camera that I've ever used. The fact that you can shoot all the way up to 4K 120 with pretty much no compromises, you can still shoot in stunning S-Log 3, and it's super easy to grade. It's just the entire workflow with this camera is just amazing, and I absolutely love this camera. But that doesn't mean that there's no room for improvement, so in this video I'm going to be going over my wish list for a potential Mark II. I list off all of these items in the order that I want them to happen in the Mark II, and the first one being, hands down, 48 frames a second. And honestly, I have no idea why this camera doesn't do 48 frames a second. That's probably my number one con about this one at the moment. That's one of those double frame rates that come in handy all the time if you're filming music videos or anytime you just want to film slow motion but you don't know if you want to slow it down later. Filming in 48 and then editing in 24 is just really handy because you can just play back the footage without introducing any stutter. And if you want to slow it down, you have the option to. Speaking of, it should also let you do 96 frames a second, but it doesn't. It's nice that it lets you do true 24p, but again, true 48 and true 96 would also be nice. At least true 48 at the bare minimum. I'm pretty sure the FX6 does it in the SNQ mode, but it's a real bummer that the FX3 doesn't. So I'm really hoping that the FX3 Mark II can potentially address that. Honestly, I'm pretty sure Sony could address it in this camera as well with a software update, but I doubt they will. So FX3 Mark II, I'm really hoping they do 48 frames a second. Let me know if you guys want me to make a full video about how camera stutter works and how you can avoid it. I'll totally do that, so let me know down below. Number 2 would be a potential 6K sensor. So this camera has a 4K sensor, and it's the exact same one that's in the A7S III and the FX6. So I really think we've had enough of this sensor now, and it might be time to bump it up to a 24 megapixel sensor that could do 6K. I'm not so sure that Sony is willing to do that, but honestly their low light with the A7R5 and even the A1, it's just gotten so good that I feel like they've mastered the ability to do low light with high megapixel sensors. That used to be the big selling point of these A7S cameras, that you could do this crazy low light stuff because the megapixel count was so low. But just looking at the recent releases, I feel like you could easily bump it up to a 24 megapixel sensor and get 6K out of this camera and still be amazing in low light. Of course, there's a small chance that they stick with the 4K sensor just because it's so well received and people love the image from this sensor, and they might just bump it up to like a 4K 200 frames a second or 240 frames a second with just a faster chip or something like that. But I'm really hoping that's not the case. A new sensor would be very welcomed, and just shooting 24 megapixels at 6K, that's just I think it's necessary with the competition going around right now. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Next up is the ability to film in open gate. And honestly, even if the camera is 4K, I at least hope that it lets you film in open gate. There's just no good reason to not let you do it. And it's really annoying that this camera doesn't let you do it. I mean, if you have a 4x3 sensor, why are we limited to 16x9? So being able to film in 4x3, the full sensor, taking advantage of all those megapixels, just would be very nice. And there's just really no downsides. I'm really hoping that the Mark II has that feature. I personally own two FX3s, one over here and the second one's right over there, all rigged out. And personally, I would trade both of these in if Sony is able to do all three of those things. I am just really looking forward to 48 frames a second, being able to shoot in 6K, and open gate. I'm just really hoping that Sony does all three of those things. And the rest of the items in this list are really just cherry on top items for me. So let's get into those. Next up, we have triple native ISO. And to be honest, this is just on the list because Canon just announced their C400, and that has triple native ISO. And I feel like Sony would just want to compete with that a little bit. This guy has dual native ISO at 800 and 12,800. So if Sony could introduce a third native at 3200, I think that would really just round things out very nicely. Right now, the 12,800 is absolutely fantastic, and I love this for weddings for that exact reason. But sometimes 3200, that middle range, is also nice to have. For example, right now I'm filming at 3200 ISO with my A7 IV, and being that the FX3 doesn't have a native at 3200, that just means that my A7 IV has a cleaner image for this shot compared to my FX3. Again, not a huge difference, but it would just be nice if they could introduce a third native at 3200. Honestly, it might just be a good marketing move because Canon is plastering triple native ISO all over the C400 marketing, and Sony will definitely want to compete with that. And at the end of the day, that just means better for us, the consumer. So yeah, triple native ISO would be nice. But if they do want to stick with the dual native, the combination of 800 and 12,800 is perfect. I wouldn't really touch that. Even though I love my A7 IV, the FX3 is just better for run and gun stuff because the 12,800 is just beautiful, magical, and you can pretty much shoot in any conditions you want, and the image looks stunning. Next up is improved IBIS, and I feel like this is something that's pretty much guaranteed to be in the next FX camera, simply because Sony just tends to never go back on stuff like this, and they've already introduced 8 stops of stabilization in the A7R Mark V, and I feel like that will definitely make its way into the FX3 Mark II. So this has like 5.5 stops, I believe, which is great for most stuff. I feel like it's really good at making you like the human tripod, if you will, but for just those following shots and other stuff like that, you still definitely need a gimbal with this. But I've just heard so many good things about the A7R5 IBIS that I would definitely want to see that in the Mark II, and I feel like we're gonna get it. I'm pretty confident. A slightly bigger redesigned body would also be very welcomed. Like right now I've got my camera in a cage, and honestly I don't really need the cage on here. I just bought the cage for the NATO rail on top, but I keep the cage on here simply because it just makes the camera slightly bulkier, and I prefer the handling of that. And I feel like even if they lean a little bit more towards like the 1DX design, maybe not the battery grip at the bottom, but just slightly chunkier, slightly bigger, it just would be nice. Maybe the R5C is a better comparison. But yeah, sometimes I just feel like this is a bit too small. I mean, the thermals are great, it has a fan inside, so that's fantastic, but just a slightly bigger body, I feel like everyone's just wanting that. People loved the new A9 III design, which was just a little bit chunkier, so I feel like that would just be better for ergonomics if the FX3 Mark II had that. You would be sacrificing some reverse compatibility with the FX3 accessories, but honestly I feel like that's totally justified, and Sony isn't too shy about changing their designs from each iteration. Like all of the A7s, the A7Ss, and the A7Rs, they've all had different body designs with every iteration, so I don't think that's gonna hold Sony back, and I really hope they just make it like 2% bigger in every dimension. That would just make it a little bit more ergonomic and better to hold. Next up is an optional EVF, and of course you can already buy third-party ones from other manufacturers that plug into the HDMI port, but since we have a hot shoe here and Sony's been doing some great stuff with the microphones that don't need cables, I feel like it would be nice to have an official EVF from Sony that you could plug right into the hot shoe here and it would just work, and that doesn't take up the HDMI port. That would just be a clever piece of design, and I feel like it would sell like hotcakes because a lot of people would just love that option. I think Blackmagic has done that with some of their pocket cinema cameras and people really like that, so it would just be really nice if Sony put some thought into an EVF accessory. Last but definitely not least, and I feel like I just have to include this or I'm gonna get roasted in the comments, and that would be internal NDs. And personally, I don't think it's going to happen in the Mark II, simply because they definitely want to keep some distinguishing factors between the FX6 and the FX3 line, and ND filters just seems to be the way that they're doing it. I personally know people who've told me that if they were to switch to Sony, they would go straight to the FX6 instead of the FX3, simply because of the internal NDs. And that's like double the price, and Sony's making a lot of money off of a lot of people willing to pay double the price for internal NDs. But hey, if they do internal NDs in the FX3 line, sure, I'll be all for it. I'm not personally a big ND filter guy, but if it's internally built into my camera, I don't mind using it. But I personally don't see that happening at all. But it would be a very welcomed addition if it does. Alright guys, don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys are looking for in a potential FX3 Mark II. And that was about it for me today. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave it a like, subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you guys next time.